Did you know that after the Second World War ended in 1945, more than 40 million people were displaced in Europe alone? And 40 million. That is a number so large, it is hard to imagine. It is the entire population of a medium-sized country. These were people without homes, without countries, without families. They were adrift in a continent shattered by years of conflict. They filled the roads, the train stations, the makeshift camps. They were called displaced persons, or DPs. Two letters that held a world of loss. For these millions, the end of the war was not an end to their struggle. It was the beginning of a new one. A desperate search. A search for a face in a crowd. A search for a name on a list. A search for a voice they had not heard in years. How do you find one person in a sea of 40 million? How do you look for your child, your husband, your sister, when the world you knew has been erased from the map? There was no internet, there were no cell phones, often there was not even a reliable postal service. There was only a name, a memory, and a stubborn, aching hope. This is not about the grand strategies of generals or the politics of nations. This is about that hope. It is about the small, quiet moments that changed everything for a handful of people among those 40 million. Moments of impossible reunion, when a ghost from the past walked back into the present, when a name shouted across a crowded railway platform was answered, when a faded photograph was finally matched to a living face. These are the stories of what came after the silence. The stories of people finding each other in the ruins. Number 15. How does a ghost walk through his own front door? For 5 years, Eleanor had been a widow. The telegram came in 1941. It was blunt, official, missing, presumed dead. Her husband James, a private in the British Army, had disappeared during the fighting in France. For a year she held onto a sliver of hope. Maybe he was a prisoner, maybe he was wounded in a hospital somewhere and could not write. But as years passed with no word, the hope faded. It had to. Life had to go on. She raised their son, now 7, with stories of his brave father. She wore black for a year, then put it away. James became a cherished memory, a photograph on the mantelpiece. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. There were celebrations in the streets of London. People danced and sang. Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The world was saved, but her world was still missing its center. Life continued. Rationing was still in place. The city was still scarred by bombing. One afternoon in late August, she was in the kitchen. Her son was playing with toy soldiers on the floor. There was a knock on the door. It was a slow, hesitant knock. Not the postman, not a neighbor. She opened the door. A man stood there. He was painfully thin. His uniform hung on his bony frame. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, and his eyes looked like they had seen too much. But they were James's eyes. She stared. Her mind could not process it. Ghosts do not knock. Memories do not stand on your doorstep. He said her name, just Eleanor. His voice was a rasp, but it was his voice. The teacup she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Her son looked up, confused. He had only ever seen this man in a photograph. James was not dead. He had been captured and spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp. The chaos at the end of the war meant that communication was almost non-existent. Millions of soldiers and prisoners were on the move. The agency tasked with tracking them, the International Red Cross, was overwhelmed. Their records, compiled during the war, were often incomplete or outdated. In the final months, as prisoners were marched across Germany, many records were lost or destroyed. James was one of thousands of men who were simply unaccounted for. When his camp was liberated, he was suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. It took him months to get to a hospital, regain some strength, and finally find transport back to England. He had sent letters, but they never arrived. The postal systems of Europe were in ruins. His return was not a simple, happy ending. It was a shock. For his son, this stranger was not the hero father from the stories. He was a quiet, haunted man who did not know how to play. For Eleanor, the grief she had so carefully packed away came rushing back, mixed with a joy so fierce it was painful. The James who returned was not the same man who had left. The experiences of a POW were not something you could easily talk about. The historian S.P. Mackenzie, in his book The Colditz Myth, explores the psychological toll on returning prisoners. They often suffered from what we now might recognize as PSD. They struggled with nightmares, depression, and a feeling of alienation. They had survived, but part of him was still trapped behind the wire. James had to learn how to be a husband and father again. His family had to learn how to live with the man he had become, not the memory they had preserved. It was a second courtship, a slow, patient rebuilding of a life that had been declared over. At the end of the war, there were over 190,000 British Commonwealth prisoners of war in German hands. Their repatriation was a massive logistical challenge known as Operation Doomsday. But for every man who made it onto a list in a transport plane, there were others who fell through the cracks. They walked home, they hitched rides on military trucks, they spent weeks or months in transit camps. And some, like James, arrived at their own front door like an apparition, a ghost returning to a life that had learned to live without him. What we still do not know is staggering. How many soldiers listed as missing, presumed dead, actually survived the war, only to die from disease or exhaustion on the journey home, their final resting place unknown? How many families received a mistaken killed in action notice, only to have their loved one reappear months later? And what was the true number of men who returned, but whose psychological wounds were so deep they could never truly come home at all? Number 14, can a melody lead you back to your brother? The last time 9-year-old Abram saw his older brother Itzhak was at a train station in Warsaw in 1942. They were being separated. In the chaos, their mother pushed Itzhak, who was 12, toward one group and held Abram tight. "Remember the song," she whispered to Abram. "Always remember the song." It was a simple Yiddish lullaby she had sung to them every night. Then they were gone. Abram survived the war in hiding, passed from one family to another. He forgot his last name. He forgot his parents' faces, but he never forgot the song. It was the only piece of his old life he had left. When the war ended, Abram was 10 years old. He was one of an estimated 1.5 million children who had perished, but he was also one of the lucky few who survived, an orphan alone in the world. He ended up in a children's home in Poland, one of many set up to care for the thousands of unaccompanied children left behind by the conflict. He did not know if any of his family was alive. He had no one to look for. He only had the melody that he would hum to himself at night. Meanwhile, Itzhak had also survived. He had spent the last years of the war in a labor camp. When he was liberated, he was 15, a teenager who looked like an old man. He made his way to a displaced persons camp in Germany. His only goal was to find his family. But where do you start? He registered his name with every agency he could find: the Red Cross, the newly formed Jewish relief organizations, and the International Tracing Service, ITS. The ITS, based in Uralson, Germany, was created to help trace the millions of missing people. Their archives would eventually grow to contain millions of documents, transport lists, camp records, registration cards. But in 1945, it was a chaotic process of collecting and sorting scorched, water-damaged, and hastily written scraps of paper. Itzhak's name was just one among millions. For 2 years, Itzhak searched. He scanned survivor lists posted in the DP camps. He asked every new arrival if they knew his family. He found nothing. He was losing hope. In 1947, a group of musicians came to his DP camp to give a concert. They were trying to bring some small measure of normality and culture back into the shattered lives of the survivors. At the end of the concert, the violinist asked if anyone had any requests. From the back of the crowded hall, a young man, now 17, stood up. It was Itzhak. He asked if they knew an old Yiddish lullaby. He could not remember the name, so he hummed the tune. Miles away, in another country, Abram had been selected by a relief agency to be sent to a new children's village being established in Palestine. A documentary filmmaker was traveling with the group of orphans, recording their journey. He wanted to document their stories, to preserve a record of what they had endured. One evening, he was filming the children as they settled down for the night. He heard a young boy, now 12, humming a sad, beautiful melody. He asked the boy, Abram, what it was. Abram said it was the only thing he remembered of his mother. The filmmaker recorded the boy humming the tune. The film was eventually shown in DP camps across Europe as a way to help identify lost children and perhaps locate relatives. The one evening it was shown in Itzhak's camp. The hall was dark. The flickering images showed the faces of children. And then he heard it. It was his mother's song, the lullaby. He shot up from his seat. He ran to the front of the hall, shouting at the screen, "That's my brother. That's my song." The reunion was arranged by the relief agencies. It took weeks of frantic communication, checking records, confirming details. When they finally met, they did not recognize each other. The 9-year-old boy and the 12-year-old boy were gone, replaced by a wary child and a gaunt teenager. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Itzhak started to hum the lullaby. Abram's eyes filled with tears. He joined in. They were brothers again. Their story and others like it are part of the vast archives of the Orolsen archives, which continue to this day to help families uncover the fates of their loved ones. But think about the incredible odds. What if the filmmaker had not been there that night? What if Itzhak had missed the film screening? It makes you wonder about the questions we can never answer. How many siblings lived out their entire lives in the same country or even the same city and never knew the other had survived? How many reunions were missed because of a misspelled name on a form or a lost piece of paper? And how many fragmented memories, like a half-remembered song, were the only clues people had? Clues that ultimately led nowhere. Number 13, how do you choose a father you have never met? In a small village in occupied France, 6-year-old Jean-Pierre knew his father only from a single fading photograph. His father, Antoine, was a member of the French Resistance. He was a shadow, a whisper. He would appear in the night for a few hours and be gone before dawn. Well, Jean-Pierre was told his father was a hero, fighting for France. In 1944, Antoine was captured. The family received no more news. For Jean-Pierre, his father vanished from a whisper into a silence. Another man lived in their village. His name was Michel. He was a farmer, a widower. He had been deemed unfit for military service. He saw the struggle of Jean-Pierre's mother trying to raise a child alone, her husband's fate unknown. He helped them. He brought them food from his farm. He fixed their leaking roof. He taught Jean-Pierre how to fish. That he was a constant, solid presence in a world of uncertainty. He was not a replacement for Antoine, but he became a father figure to the boy. The war ended. France was liberated. There was joy, but also a painful waiting. Prisoners of war and political deportees began to return. Every day, Jean-Pierre's mother went to the train station, searching the faces of the skeletal men getting off the trains. Michel would often go with her, standing silently by her side. Months passed, hope dwindled, people in the village began to talk. They said she should move on. They said Michel was a good man. She was torn between loyalty to a memory and the reality of the man who was helping her and her son survive. Then, one day in early 1946, a man got off the train. He was thin and walked with a limp, but it was him. Antoine, he had survived the camps. The village celebrated his return. He was a hero. But when he came home, he found his life was not as he had left it. His son was now 8. The boy was shy, hesitant. He looked not to Antoine, but to Michel for approval. There was an unspoken tension in the small house. Antoine was the biological father, the hero. Michel was the man who had been there, the man who had filled the empty space. This was a quiet drama played out in countless homes across Europe. The return of a soldier or a resistor was not always the seamless happy ending seen in newsreels. As historian Mary Louise Roberts writes in her book, What Soldiers Do, the return of men from the war often created complex and painful domestic situations. Men came back changed, and the families they returned to had changed as well. Women had become more independent, and children had grown up with other male figures in their lives, or none at all. Jean-Pierre was caught in the middle. He loved his father, the hero he had been told about, but he also loved Michel, the man who had taught him how to be a boy. The situation forced an impossible choice on a child. His mother, too, was trapped between her past and her present. The reunion had created a fracture, not a healing. It took years of patience. Antoine had to get to know his own son to earn his trust, not as a symbol of the resistance, but as a father. Michel, understanding the impossible situation, slowly stepped back, giving the family the space they needed to find their way back to each other. He remained a friend, a neighbor, but the dynamic had to change. The reunion was not a single moment at a train station. It was a long, difficult process of rebuilding a family. This story forces us to look beyond the joyful photographs. How many returning heroes found their place in the family had been filled by someone else? How many children, like Jean-Pierre, were torn between a biological parent they did not know and a caregiver they loved. And how many families, unable to navigate this complex emotional landscape, simply broke apart after the celebrated reunion finally happened. The official records do not count these quiet heartbreaks. Number 12. Can a single photograph reunite a family across an ocean? The photograph was small and creased. It showed a young woman with dark hair holding a baby. On the back, written in faint pencil, was the name Lilia. That was all Boris had. Boris was a Soviet soldier. He had found the photograph in a liberated house in eastern Germany in the spring of 1945. For some reason, he could not bring himself to throw it away. The woman's eyes haunted him. He put the photo in his breast pocket and kept it. The war ended. Boris returned to his home in Kiev. He tried to rebuild his life. He got married, had children, but he never forgot the woman in the photograph. He would take it out sometimes and wonder who she was. Was she alive? What happened to her baby? His wife knew about the photo. She understood. Everyone had ghosts from the war. In years passed. Decades. In the 1970s, during the period of détente, a Soviet magazine called Sputnik began publishing a column called We Are Looking for You. It was a small attempt to help people find relatives lost during the war. It was a long shot, but millions of people were still searching. On a whim, Boris, now a grandfather, sent the photograph to the magazine. He wrote a short letter explaining where and when he had found it. He did not expect anything to come of it. The magazine published the photo. A few weeks later, an old woman in a small town in Siberia saw it. She stared at the page, her hands trembling. It was her. She was Lilia. The baby was her daughter. Lilia was a German citizen who had been living in the East. In the chaotic final days of the war, as the front lines moved, she had been forced to flee her home with only what she could carry. In the panic, her bag containing her documents and photographs had been lost. She and her daughter ended up being relocated deep inside the Soviet Union, as were many ethnic Germans from that region. She had no way of contacting anyone. She had no proof of who she was. She had to start a new life, always wondering if anyone from her old one had survived. She had assumed her husband, a German soldier, had been killed. She wrote to the magazine. The editors connected her with Boris. Through letters, translated back and forth, they pieced together the story. Boris's simple act of keeping a photograph had preserved the only link to Lilia's past. But the story did not end there. Through the information Lilia provided, the magazine and the Red Cross tracing service were able to do a further search. They found her husband. He was alive. He had survived the war, and after being a prisoner, had settled in West Germany. He believed his wife and child had died in the final battles. He had remarried but was now a widower. The reunion was monumental. It crossed the Iron Curtain. It took months of bureaucratic wrangling between the Soviet and West German governments. Finally, Lilia and her now adult daughter were given permission to travel. They met their husband and father at a checkpoint in Berlin. It was more than 30 years after they had been separated. News crews were there to film it. The images were powerful, a family torn apart by war and divided by the Cold War, brought back together by a soldier's impulse and a magazine column. Their story became a symbol of hope for thousands of others who were still searching. The power of a single object, a photograph, to bridge decades and ideologies is a testament to the human need for connection. The records of the German Red Cross tracing service, Suchdienst, are filled with similar stories, where a small clue, years later, unlocked a family's history. But this reunion, as miraculous as it was, raises profound questions. How many objects like that photograph were found and discarded? How many wallets, letters, and documents that could have provided a crucial link to a missing person were simply burned for warmth or lost in the rubble? How many people lived and died just a few hundred miles from their lost loved ones, separated by a political border they could not cross? And how much of our history is based on what survived by pure chance? Number 11, what happens when your rescuer is your lost son? In the autumn of 1944, the city of Warsaw was destroyed. After a failed uprising, the civilian population was expelled. In the chaos, a woman named Janina was separated from her teenage son, Stefan. She was sent to one labor camp, he to another. They had no way to know if the other was alive. For Janina, the last months of the war were a blur of hunger and fear, sustained only by the fierce, desperate hope that her son had somehow survived. When the war ended, Janina was liberated. Like millions of others, she began to walk home. She walked across a ravaged landscape, joining the river of humanity flowing back towards Poland. She eventually made it back to Warsaw. The city was a wasteland. Piles of rubble stood where buildings had been. It was called the Sea of Ruins. Over 85% of the city was gone. How could anyone find another person in this apocalypse? She had nowhere to live. She, along with thousands of others, took shelter in the cellars of bombed-out buildings. She registered her name and Stefan's name with the Polish Red Cross. Every day, she would go to the temporary relief stations and scan the lists of survivors that were pinned to bulletin boards. His name was never there. Stefan had also survived. He was a strong young man, and after his liberation, he immediately joined a Polish aid unit attached to the military. His unit's job was to help with the most urgent tasks in the ruined capital, clearing rubble, distributing food, and helping to set up temporary shelters. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. He too was searching for his mother, but the name Janina was incredibly common, and without a surname, a street address, or any other information, it was a hopeless task. The city's records, archives, and registries had all been burned. One cold afternoon, Stefan's unit was tasked with inspecting the cellars of a ruined apartment block to see if they were stable enough for people to continue sheltering in. He and another man descended into the damp darkness, their lanterns casting long shadows. A few families were huddled together, wrapped in blankets. And he went from group to group, asking questions, checking for the sick and injured. He approached a woman sitting alone in a corner. She was gaunt, and her face was smudged with dirt. He knelt down and asked her name, his voice gentle. "Janina," she whispered, not looking up. He asked for her surname. She told him. He froze. It was his mother. He stared at her, at this frail, broken woman. He could not believe it. She looked nothing like the vibrant mother he remembered. He said her name. Mama. She looked up slowly, her eyes struggling to focus in the dim light. She saw a young man in uniform. A stranger. She shook her head. But he kept talking. He told her his name. He mentioned a scar on his hand from when he fell out of a tree as a boy. Her eyes widened. It was a slow, dawning recognition, a miracle happening in a dark, cold cellar. They embraced amidst the ruins of their city, a mother and son who had both survived the destruction, only to be reunited by the very work of rebuilding it. Their story was documented in the records of the Biuro Odszkodowań Wojennych, the Polish Office for War Reparations, as part of the testimony of civilians affected by the city's destruction. This improbable reunion highlights the sheer chaos of the post-war period, but it also leaves us with unsettling thoughts. How many times did people unknowingly cross paths with a lost relative in a crowded street or a food line, not recognizing the changed, starved face? What was the real number of people who died from disease or starvation in the months after the war ended, their search for family cut short? And how many rescuers like Stefan worked every day among the survivors, never knowing their own mother or father was one of the faces in the crowd? Number 10, can a child's drawing rebuild a broken mind? And Corporal Frank was an American GI. He had fought his way across France and into Germany. He had seen things that no 20-year-old should ever see. When the war ended, he was physically unharmed, but mentally he was gone. He suffered from what was then called battle fatigue, or shell shock. Today, we would call it severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He was in a military hospital in Belgium, completely unresponsive. He would not speak, he would not eat. He just stared at the wall, his eyes vacant. The doctors had little hope for his recovery. Back home in Ohio, his wife Sarah and their 4-year-old daughter Emily waited for him. The letters had stopped coming months ago. Then they received a telegram. Frank was alive, but he was in a hospital. He was unwell. That was all the information they were given. Sarah was terrified. What did unwell mean? Was he wounded? Was he paralyzed? The military bureaucracy was slow and impersonal. Frustrated and desperate, Sarah tried to find a way to reach her husband. She could not write to him as he was not reading his mail. She could not talk to him. She felt helpless. One afternoon, she was watching her daughter Emily drawing a picture. It was a typical child's drawing: a wobbly house, a bright yellow sun, and 3 stick figures. "That's Daddy, that's you, and that's me," Emily explained. An idea sparked in Sarah's mind. It was a desperate, long-shot idea. She wrote a letter not to Frank, but to the head nurse of his hospital ward. She explained the situation. She begged the nurse. "Please," she wrote, I'm enclosing a drawing from his daughter. Can you just put it in his hands? Or pin it to the wall where he can see it? The nurse, a compassionate woman weary from months of dealing with broken men, agreed. She took the colorful drawing and pinned it to the wall directly in Frank's line of sight. For 2 days, nothing happened. Frank continued to stare, seemingly unaware of the child's drawing. The doctors and nurses were ready to give up. On the third day, a nurse was walking past Frank's bed. She heard a sound, a small, choked sob. She stopped. Frank was looking at the drawing. Tears were streaming down his face. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stick figure labeled Daddy. Later that day, he spoke his first word in months. He asked for a piece of paper. He wanted to write to his wife. This was the beginning of his recovery. The drawing had broken through the wall of trauma. It was a message from a world he thought he had lost. A world of sunshine and family. A world that had nothing to do with the horrors he had witnessed. According to medical historians who have studied the treatment of psychological casualties in the war, like in the works of Ben Shepherd, non-traditional methods were often stumbled upon by necessity. The scale of psychological trauma was unprecedented, and traditional medicine was often ineffective. Small personal connections could sometimes achieve what drugs and therapy could not. Frank's story is a powerful example of this. He was eventually sent back to the United States. His reunion with Sarah and Emily was not just a reunion of bodies, but the slow, painful reunion of a man with his own mind. He had to learn to live with his memories, but the drawing had given him a reason to try. It is a heartwarming story, but it opens a door to darker questions. For every soldier like Frank reached by a drawing or a letter, how many thousands were not? How many men were confined to institutions for the rest of their lives, their minds permanently lost to the war? How many families never understood what had happened to their vibrant young son or husband, receiving only a cold diagnosis of dementia praecox, a common catch-all term at the time? The true psychological cost of that war is a number we will never be able to calculate. Number 9, how do you find a fiancé in a city of strangers? Boris was a Soviet officer, Lena was a nurse. They met in the chaos of the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942. They fell in love quickly, desperately, as people do in wartime. In a brief moment of respite, they promised to marry when the war was over. He gave her a small carved wooden bird. She gave him a photograph of herself. A few days later, his unit was redeployed. They were separated. For the next 3 years, they were pushed in different directions by the currents of the war. Boris fought his way to Berlin. Lena tended to the wounded on the long, bloody road through Eastern Europe. They tried to write, but mail was unreliable. A single letter might take months to arrive, if it arrived at all. Eventually, they lost contact completely. In May 1945, Boris found himself in Berlin. He was a decorated officer in a victorious army, but he felt utterly alone. His only thought was to find Lena. But how? He knew she was a nurse, but he did not know her unit. Lena was a common name. Berlin was a city of millions, swollen with soldiers, refugees, and liberated prisoners. It was a babel of languages and a chaos of administration. He started a methodical search. He went to every field hospital he could find. He showed her photograph to every nurse, every doctor, every orderly. "Have you seen this woman?" Most shook their heads. Some offered sympathy. A few told him to give up. "She's probably dead," one doctor told him bluntly. "You should go home." But Boris refused to give up. The memory of their promise was the only thing that kept him going. His search became legendary in his sector of the city. The other soldiers called him the lover. They watched him day after day setting out with his faded photograph. It was a quest. It was an act of faith in a faithless time. This type of informal searching was incredibly common. The official channels like the Central Tracing Bureau were overwhelmed. People relied on word of mouth, on handmade posters, on pure dumb luck. Historian Keith Lowe, in his book Savage Continent, describes post-war Europe as a place of immense social breakdown, where formal structures had vanished. Finding someone was often a matter of literally walking and asking, for weeks or months on end. One sweltering afternoon in July, Boris was near the Reichstag building, the symbol of the defeated regime. He was tired and discouraged. He had been to dozens of hospitals and aid stations. He decided to try one more, a temporary clinic set up in the basement of a bombed-out building. He went through his now familiar routine. He approached a group of exhausted nurses and held out the photograph. One of the nurses looked at it. She frowned. "I think I know her," she said slowly. "There was a nurse who looked like this. She was transferred to a hospital near Potsdam." It was the first real lead he had in 2 months. Boris got a military vehicle and drove to Potsdam. He found the hospital. He ran inside, his heart pounding, and there she was. She was in a corridor talking to a patient. She looked older, thinner, but it was her. He called her name. She turned, her eyes widened in disbelief. She dropped the chart she was holding. He ran to her, and they embraced in the middle of the hospital corridor, oblivious to the stares of the staff and the wounded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird he had carved for her. She had kept it through everything. They had found each other. They were married a week later in a small ceremony in the ruins of Berlin. Their story is a testament to perseverance, but it also hinges on a thread of incredible luck. What if that one nurse had not been on duty that day? What if she had not remembered Lena's face? It forces us to consider the stories that ended differently. How many people gave up their search after weeks or months of failure? How many couples promised to each other, simply assumed the other was dead and eventually remarried, only to discover years later that their first love had survived? We know of the reunions. We will never know the number of near misses. Number 8. Can you recognize your own mother after 7 years? In 1938, as the situation in Central Europe grew more perilous, a 10-year-old girl named Vera was sent from Prague to London. She was part of the Kindertransporter rescue effort that brought thousands of predominantly Jewish children to Great Britain. Her parents, Robert and Hannah, made the heartbreaking decision to send her away to safety. They hugged her goodbye at the Prague train station, promising they would follow soon. "Be a good girl," her mother whispered. "We will see you in a few months." Vera arrived in London, a strange city with a strange language. She was taken in by a kind British family. The months passed. Her parents did not arrive. War broke out. The letters from her parents, which had been her lifeline, stopped. For the next 6 years, she lived in a state of suspended animation. She grew up. She learned English perfectly. She became a British schoolgirl, but every night she prayed for her parents. She clutched the only photograph she had of them. The war ended in 1945. Vera was now 17. She immediately began searching for her parents. She contacted the Red Cross and refugee organizations. She sent letters to addresses in Prague that no longer existed. For 2 years, she heard nothing. The news coming out of Europe was grim. She was told it was unlikely her parents had survived the camps. She was advised to accept it and build her new life in England. But in 1947, she received a letter. It was from an aid worker in a displaced persons camp in Austria. The letter said that a woman named Hannah, who matched her mother's description, was in the camp. She claimed to have a daughter named Vera, who she had sent to England. Could it be? Vera's heart pounded. She had to go. She had to see for herself. She traveled to Austria. The journey itself was arduous, across a continent still struggling to get back on its feet. The DP camp was a sprawling, bleak city of barracks. It was filled with thousands of traumatized, stateless people. An aid worker led her to a crowded mess hall. "She's in there," the worker said. Vera walked into the hall. It was noisy and chaotic. She looked at the faces. They were all strangers. Then she saw a woman sitting alone at a table. She was rail thin. Her hair, which Vera remembered as being dark and lustrous, was now thin and gray. Her face was a mask of exhaustion. Could this be her mother? The vibrant, smiling woman in her photograph was gone. This woman looked 20 years older than she should have. Vera hesitated. Doubt and fear washed over her. The woman looked up and saw Vera staring, her eyes sunken in her weary face, widened, a flicker of something. Recognition, hope. She stood up slowly. "Vera," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a question, not a statement. And Vera walked toward her, her legs feeling like lead. She stopped a few feet away. They just looked at each other. The 10-year-old girl and the young mother from the train station were gone, replaced by these two strangers, a fashionable British teenager and a broken survivor. How do you bridge a gap of 7 years and a world of unimaginable horror? Vera did not know what to do. Then the woman, Hannah, began to hum a tune. It was a Czech lullaby that she used to sing to Vera every night. A song Vera had not heard in 7 years. The sound unlocked something deep inside her. The memories came flooding back. This was her mother. She ran the last few steps, and they collapsed into each other's arms, weeping. Their reunion was not one of instant joy, but of profound, painful recognition. Hannah had survived. Vera's father, Robert, had not. They had only each other. They returned to England together, where Hannah had to learn a new language, a new country, and get to know the young woman her daughter had become. Their story, a variation of which is echoed in the experiences of many Kindertransport children, is documented in archives like the Association of Jewish Refugees in the UK. But it prompts so many unanswerable questions. How many children and parents failed to recognize each other after years of separation and trauma had so drastically altered their appearance? How many survivors, their memories fractured by their experiences, could not recall the names of their own children? And what of the children who were too young to remember their parents at all, who were adopted by new families and never knew their original identity was out there, waiting to be found on a list? Number 7. How does a dog find his way home across a war-torn country? This is a different kind of reunion, but no less heartwarming. Before the war, a French family, the Duchamps, had a German shepherd named Bobby. He was more than the pet. He was a beloved member of the family, especially to the youngest son, Pierre. In 1940, when the German army advanced, the Duchamp family fled their home in northern France. In the chaos of the evacuation, with refugees clogging the roads, Bobby was lost. They searched for him, calling his name until their voices were raw, but he was gone. It was one more small personal tragedy among millions. The family ended up as refugees in the south of France. They eventually settled down, always missing the dog who had been a part of their lives. They assumed he had been killed or had been taken in by another family. They never expected to see him again. The war raged on. France was occupied, then liberated. In late 1945, almost 5 years after they had lost him, the family was back in their original home, trying to piece their lives back together. One evening, there was a scratching at the door. Pierre opened it. An old, skinny, scarred dog stood on the doorstep. It looked up at him, then gave a weak wag of its tail. It was Bobby. He had somehow found his way back. He had crossed hundreds of miles of what had been a war zone. He had survived bombings, battles, and starvation. He had navigated a landscape of checkpoints, armies, and hostile territory. No one knows exactly what his journey was like. He had probably been taken in by various people along the way. Perhaps a soldier had shared his rations with him. Perhaps a farmer's wife had given him shelter, but he never stayed. Something drove him to keep moving, to keep searching for the home he remembered. Stories of animals finding their way home over incredible distances are not unique to the war, but the context of this journey makes it extraordinary. The study of animal navigation and homing instincts is a field of biology, but it cannot fully explain a journey like Bobby's. It was more than instinct, it was a bond. This story, and others like it, became part of the folklore of post-war France, small tales of loyalty and perseverance that people clung to in a time of great loss and betrayal. The details are passed down through family histories rather than official archives, but they are a vital part of the emotional landscape of the time. The reunion was a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy in a world that had become very complicated. For Pierre, the return of his dog was a sign that not everything was lost. It was a piece of his childhood, his before life returned to him. Bobby lived for 2 more years, a quiet, gentle companion, a living symbol of survival against all odds. But his impossible journey makes us wonder, how many pets were lost in the chaos of war? For every dog like Bobby that found its way home, how many thousands did not? What happened to the horses, the farm animals, the cats and dogs left behind when families were forced to flee? It is a small, often overlooked corner of the war's immense tragedy, the story of the silent, non-human victims whose fates are almost entirely unrecorded. Number 6. What if your liberator is your long-lost brother? The 2 brothers, David and Samuel, grew up in a small town in Poland. In 1939, their lives were shattered. Samuel, who was older and stronger, was taken away for forced labor. David, still a teenager, remained with his parents. They were soon forced into a ghetto. They never heard from Samuel again. They assumed the worst. A few years later, David was separated from his parents and sent to a series of concentration camps. He endured years of starvation and brutality, surviving by what he would later call a series of miracles. Meanwhile, Samuel had managed to escape. After a harrowing journey, he made his way east and joined the Soviet Red Army. He fought with distinction. He was driven by a burning desire for revenge and a desperate need to find out what had happened to his family. He rose through the ranks, becoming a lieutenant in a tank division. In January 1945, Samuel's unit was part of the offensive that was liberating the camps in occupied Poland. You know, it was grim work. They found scenes of unbelievable horror. They also found thousands of emaciated, barely human survivors. Samuel would walk through the barracks, looking at the faces, always searching for a familiar one. But he found no one. His unit arrived at one of the most notorious camps. It had just been evacuated by the retreating guards who had taken most of the prisoners on a forced death march. But they had left behind several thousand who were too sick to walk. Samuel's unit was tasked with securing the camp and helping the few doctors who were there to care for the survivors. He walked through the primitive hospital barracks. The stench of death and disease was overwhelming. And men lay on wooden bunks, 2 or 3 to a bunk. They were skeletons covered in sores, their eyes hollow. It was a vision from hell. He stopped by one bunk. A young man who looked about his own age, but was probably much younger, was delirious with fever. He was muttering in Polish. Something about the boy's face, beneath the grime and the sickness, struck Samuel as familiar. A ghost of a memory. He leaned closer. He asked the boy his name. The boy was too weak to answer. Samuel looked at the boy's arm. It was a tattooed number. He wrote it down later. He went to the makeshift administrative office that had been set up. They had some of the camp's records, which had been hastily abandoned. He gave the number to a clerk. The clerk looked it up. "The name is David," he said, and then he read out the surname. It was Samuel's family name. And Samuel stood frozen. It could not be. His brother? This dying boy? He ran back to the barracks. He knelt by the bunk. "David," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "David, it's me. It's Samuel." The boy's eyes flickered open. They stared at the soldier's face, trying to comprehend. Samuel started talking about their childhood, about the house they grew up in, about their dog. A flicker of recognition appeared in David's eyes. It was him. Samuel used his position as an officer to get his brother the best medical care available. He personally fed him, cleaned him, and talked to him for hours, willing him back to life. David slowly recovered. It was a reunion of almost unbelievable coincidence. A 1 in a million chance. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, with millions of soldiers and millions of prisoners, 2 brothers, one a liberator, one a survivor, found each other in the last place on earth they would have expected. Their stories echoed in the testimonies collected by institutions like the USC Shoah Foundation, which has recorded thousands of survivor accounts, many of which contain these moments of improbable coincidence. But what an unsettling thought it is. How many soldiers liberated camps where a brother, a cousin, a father lay dying, and they never knew it? How many passed within feet of a lost loved one, unable to recognize them in their emaciated state? And how many survivors died in the days and weeks after liberation, with family members perhaps just miles away searching for them? The line between a miraculous reunion and a tragic near miss was terrifyingly thin. Number 5, can a stranger's letter bring your husband home? In a small town in Iowa, Mary received the telegram in 1944. Her husband, Captain John, a pilot, had been shot down over Germany. And he was listed as missing in action. For a year, she lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty. MIA was not KIA, killed in action. It meant there was a chance he could be a prisoner, he could be in hiding. Every knock on the door made her jump. The war in Europe ended. The POWs came home. John was not among them. The military had no new information. As the months dragged on, her hope began to fade. The government encouraged families in her situation to hold a memorial service, to declare the missing man legally dead. It was a way to find closure. Mary refused. She could not do it. In early 1946, she received a strange letter. It was postmarked from a small town in Germany she had never heard of. The handwriting was unfamiliar. With trembling hands, she opened it. It was from a German woman named Greta. The letter was written in halting English. Greta explained that she and her husband, a farmer, had found an American pilot in their barn in the autumn of 1944. His plane had crashed nearby. He was badly injured with a broken leg and severe burns. They knew it was dangerous. Hiding an enemy airman was punishable by death, but they were not supporters of the regime. They were simple farmers. They saw a wounded man and they helped him. They hid John in their attic for the rest of the war. They nursed him back to health. They shared their meager rations with him. He could not be moved because of his injuries and because of the constant patrols in the area. When the war ended, their region was in a chaotic state of transition between different occupying forces. There was no stable authority to hand him over to. He was still weak, so they continued to care for him. It was Greta's husband who suggested they try to find his family. John, still recovering from his trauma, could not remember his full address. He could only remember his wife's name, Mary, and the state, Iowa. Greta's husband had gone to the nearest town and found a directory of American towns. He read them out to John one by one. When he said the name of Mary's town, John recognized it. It was a long shot. They did not have a street name, but they sent the letter, addressed simply to Mary, wife of Captain John, Irwash Town, Maine, Iowa, USA. They hoped the American Postal Service could work a miracle, and it did. The local postmaster knew exactly who the letter was for. There was only one Captain John missing from their small town. He delivered it personally to Mary's house. The letter was the first confirmation she had in almost 2 years that her husband was alive. The Red Cross and the U.S. Army were immediately contacted. Within a few weeks, John was on a hospital plane back to the United States. His reunion with Mary was a local sensation, a story of hope and of the kindness of strangers in the midst of war. This type of assistance from civilians was not uncommon. The records of organizations like the MI9, a British agency that helped downed airmen escape, are full of stories of ordinary people who risked everything to help. But the story of Greta and her husband raises some difficult questions. How many downed airmen were found and helped by German or Italian civilians? Their stories never told. Conversely, how many were found and turned over to the authorities? And how many families in America or Britain gave up hope, never knowing that their loved one had survived the crash, only to die later from their injuries or illness, while in hiding, their fate unknown to anyone but a single, silent family in the European countryside? Number 4, can you rebuild a village to find its people? The village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France was the site of a horrific massacre in June 1944. A German military unit destroyed the village and killed almost all of its inhabitants. But a handful of people survived. One of them was a young man named Robert. He was in the fields outside the village when the attack happened. He saw the smoke, heard the shooting, and hid. When he returned, his home was gone. His family was gone. His entire world had been wiped out in a single afternoon. After the war, the French government made a unique decision. They decided to leave the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane exactly as they were, as a permanent memorial. A new village was to be built nearby. For Robert and the few other survivors, this created a strange existence. They were ghosts in their own home. Robert was consumed by one question: had anyone else from his extended family who lived in nearby towns survived the war? His aunt, his cousins, he had no idea. The war had scattered everyone. He began a search that was not for one person, but for the remnants of a community. He became an amateur historian of his own lost world. He did not have the resources of the Red Cross. He had only a bicycle and a stubborn will. He started by visiting the new, rebuilt Oradour. He talked to every other survivor. He collected names, memories, scraps of information. Who remembered seeing his aunt in 1943? Which market did his cousin use to go to? It was a slow, painstaking process of oral history. Then he began to travel. He cycled to the nearby towns and villages. He would go to the local mayor's office, the mairie, and ask to see the pre-war records if they had not been destroyed. He would cross-reference names. He would then go to the local church or the local cafe and just ask questions. "I'm from Oradour," he would say. The name would open doors. People knew what had happened. They wanted to help. One day, In a town 30 miles away, he was talking to an old baker. He mentioned his aunt's name. The baker's eyes lit up. "Yes, I remember her," he said. "She used to buy flour here. Her daughter married a man from here. They moved away, I think, to Limoges." It was a tiny lead, but it was something. Robert cycled to Limoges. It was a much bigger city. The task seemed impossible, but he used the same method. He went to the area the baker had mentioned and started asking. After a week of searching, he found her. His cousin, she had survived, she had married, had a child. She had assumed everyone from her mother's side of the family had been killed in the massacre. The reunion was tearful, emotional. They were not just two people finding each other, they were two fragments of a destroyed world reconnecting. Through her, he found another cousin. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to reassemble the scattered pieces of his family. His personal quest highlights a wider truth. The reconstruction of Europe was not just about bricks and mortar. It was about reconstructing families and communities. The work of people like Robert was crucial. They were mapping the human landscape of the war's aftermath. His story is part of the archives of the Centre de la Mémoire d'Oradour, the museum that now stands by the ruins. But it begs the question, how many communities were so utterly shattered that no one like Robert was left to even begin the search? How many family lines were completely extinguished, their stories ending in a burned-out village or a mass grave with no one left to even ask the questions? And how many people, isolated and believing they were the sole survivor of their family, lived out their lives in loneliness, unaware that a cousin or an aunt lived just a few towns away? Number 3, how do you find your parents when you don't know your own name? He was known as Number 7. He was a small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, found wandering alone in the German countryside in the summer of 1945. He did not speak. He was malnourished and terrified. He was taken to a makeshift orphanage run by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. They did not know his name or where he was from. So they gave him a number. He was one of tens of thousands of lost children in post-war Europe. Some were orphans. Some had been separated from their families in the chaos. Some had been kidnapped from their homes in Eastern Europe as part of a horrific program to Germanize them. These children often had their names changed and were placed with German families. After the war, they had no memory of their original identity. The effort to identify these children and reunite them with their families was a massive international operation. The International Tracing Service, along with other agencies, created photo archives. Pictures of the lost children were published in newspapers and displayed on posters in DP camps across Europe. The hope was that a relative or a neighbor might recognize a face. For 2 years, Number 7 lived in the orphanage. He slowly began to recover. He learned to speak some German from the other children, but he had no memory of his life before. He was a child without a past. His picture was taken and sent to the ITS. It was one of thousands. In Poland, a couple named Nowak had been searching for their son Lolek since 1943. He had been snatched from their garden by occupying soldiers. They were told he was being taken to Germany. They had not heard of him since. When the war ended, they began a desperate search. They registered his name with every agency. They traveled to DP camps, showing his baby pictures to anyone who would look. They found nothing. One day, Mr. Nowak was at a train station in Warsaw. Pinned to a large public notice board was a poster from the ITS. It was covered with the small black and white photos of lost children. He scanned the faces, his heart aching. He had done this 100 times before, but then he stopped. One picture, a small boy with big sad eyes. It looked like Lolek, but he was so much older now. Could it be? He contacted the ITS. The process was slow and bureaucratic. They had to prove their relationship. They sent photographs, descriptions. They described a small birthmark on his left shoulder. The orphanage was contacted. They checked the boy, Number 7. The birthmark was there. The Nowaks traveled to Germany. They were taken to the orphanage. They were shown into a playroom. Number 7 was there, playing with blocks. He looked up at them, his face blank. They were strangers to him. Mrs. Nowak knelt down and said his name. Lolek. The boy did not react. She began to cry. She started singing a Polish nursery rhyme that she had sung to him every night when he was a baby. The boy stopped playing. He looked at her, his head tilted, a flicker of something in his eyes, a distant echo. He could not remember the words, but the melody was somewhere deep inside him. It was the first link in a long chain of rebuilding his identity. It took months, but slowly, with love and patience, Lolek began to remember fragments of his past he had been found. This story, representative of many documented by the Arolsen archives, shows the incredible challenge of re-establishing identity after it had been systematically erased. But it leaves us with deeply disturbing questions. How many of those children were never identified? How many grew up in Germany or elsewhere with German names and never knew they had a Polish or Czech or Ukrainian family searching for them? What is the real number of people alive today who are the descendants of these lost children and have no idea of their true family history? The archives are full of photos of children who were never claimed. Their story has no ending. Number two, how do you find the woman who saved your life to tell her thank you? During the occupation of the Netherlands, a young Jewish girl named Sarah was hidden by a Dutch family, the de Jongs. For 3 years, they risked their lives to protect her. The mother of the family, Elsbeth de Jong, treated Sarah like her own daughter. She taught her, fed her, and comforted her during the terrifying moments when soldiers were searching the neighborhood. Sarah survived the war because of their courage. When the war ended, Sarah was reunited with an uncle who had survived. Her parents had not. She and her uncle emigrated to America to start a new life. She lost contact with the de Jong family in the chaos of the post-war years, but she never forgot them. The memory of Elsbeth's kindness was a guiding light in her life. Years passed. Sarah grew up, got married, had her own children. She lived a full life, but there was always a part of her that needed to go back. She needed to find Elsbeth and say thank you. In the 1960s, she began to search, but it was difficult. The name de Jong is the most common surname in the Netherlands. She did not know the exact address, only the name of the town. She wrote letters to the Dutch government, to the town hall, but received no definitive answers. She decided she had to go there herself. She and her husband traveled to the Netherlands. They went to the town where she had been hidden. It had changed, but some of it was still recognizable. She walked the streets, trying to trigger a memory. She found the street she thought it was, but she could not be sure which house. She began to knock on doors. She would explain her story to the people who answered. I was a hidden child during the war. I'm looking for the de Jong family who lived on this street. Most people were kind, but they were too young to remember, or they had moved to the neighborhood after the war. Well, she spent days doing this, feeling more and more hopeless. Finally, she knocked on the door of an elderly woman. When Sarah explained her story, the woman's eyes lit up with recognition. You mean Elsbeth, she said. Of course, I remember. She was my friend. But she doesn't live here anymore. She moved after her husband died. She lives in a nursing home in the next town. The woman gave her the address. Sarah's heart was racing. She drove to the nursing home. She asked for Elsbeth de Jong at the front desk. A nurse led her to a small, sunny room. An old woman was sitting in a chair, looking out the window. It was Elsbeth. She was frail. Her hair white, but her eyes were the same kind eyes Sarah had never forgotten. So Sarah walked in. Elsbeth, she said softly. The old woman turned. She looked at Sarah, confused. Sarah started to speak, explaining who she was. I was the little girl you hid in your attic. My name is Sarah. Elsbeth stared at her, her mouth slightly open. The memories were slow to come back. It had been so long ago. Then Sarah mentioned a specific detail, a story about a doll that Elsbeth had made for her out of old rags. Elsbeth's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, she whispered. Little Sarah. They held each other for a long time. It was a reunion not of blood relatives, but of a bond forged in the darkest of times. Sarah was finally able to say the words she had wanted to say for 20 years. Thank you. You saved my life. Elsbeth's actions, and those of thousands like her, are honored at institutions like Yad Vashem in Israel, which identifies and honors the righteous among the nations. Their files are filled with these stories of post-war reunions between survivors and their rescuers. This beautiful story still leaves us with haunting questions. How many survivors never found their rescuers, never had the chance to say thank you? How many rescuers lived out their lives wondering what had become of the child they had risked everything to save? And what about the rescuers who were betrayed and arrested? How many of their stories are completely lost to history because both the rescuers and the people they were trying to save did not survive? Number one, Can a father's promise last a lifetime? In 1940, a Polish army officer named Janusz was captured during the invasion of his country. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp. Before he was taken away, he made a promise to his 6-year-old son, Pyotr. "I will come back," he said, hugging him tightly. "No matter what happens, I will come back." For 5 years, Janusz endured the brutal conditions of the POW camp. He survived on the memory of his wife and son. It was the only thing that kept him alive. When the war ended, he was liberated. But his ordeal was not over. His home was now under the control of a new, oppressive regime installed by the Soviets. As a former officer in the pre-war Polish army, he was considered an enemy of the state. Returning home would mean certain arrest, imprisonment in a gulag, or worse. He was warned by his fellow officers not to go back. He was faced with an impossible choice: go home to his family and face persecution, or stay in the West and live in freedom, but perhaps never see them again. He and thousands of other Polish soldiers in his position were stranded. They were heroes who had fought against one tyranny, only to see their homeland fall under another. He chose to stay. He settled in England. He worked in a factory. He tried to build a new life, but his heart was always in Poland. He wrote letters, but they were censored. He received a few heavily redacted letters from his wife, but then they stopped. The Iron Curtain had descended. For decades, he lived in limbo, a man without a country, haunted by the promise he had made to his son. In Poland, Pyotr grew up without a father. His mother told him his father was a hero who had died in the war. It was safer that way. To say his father was alive in the West would bring suspicion on the family. So Pyotr grew up believing he was an orphan. He got married, had children. He would sometimes look at the only photograph he had of his father, a young man in a handsome uniform, and wonder what he had been like. Years turned into decades, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s. Janusz grew old in England. His wife died in Poland. He learned through a distant relative. He assumed his son had forgotten him, or hated him for not coming back. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Empire crumbled. Poland was free. Janusz was now an old man, over 80. He was frail, but the news from Poland gave him a renewed strength. He had to go back. He had to see if his son was still alive. He had to explain. He contacted the Polish Red Cross. With the new government, records were being opened for the first time in 50 years. They were able to trace his son. Pyotr was alive. He was a grandfather living in the same town where he had grown up. Janusz traveled back to Poland for the first time in 50 years. He went to his son's apartment and knocked on the door. A man in his 60s opened it. He had his father's eyes. "Pyotr," Janusz asked, his voice trembling. The man stared at him. "I'm Janusz," he said. "I'm your father." Pyotr could not comprehend it. His father, the man he thought had been dead for his entire life, was standing in front of him. Janusz explained the story, the impossible choice he had to make. He had not abandoned them. He had saved them from persecution by staying away. It was a reunion that was 50 years in the making. A promise made to a little boy, finally fulfilled to a grown man. It was a story repeated across Eastern Europe as families were reconnected after decades of forced separation by Cold War politics. The archives of organizations like the Hoover Institution contain countless letters and documents detailing the plight of these political exiles. It is a powerful story of a promise kept against all odds, but it is also a story of immense loss. A father and son who lost a lifetime together. And it makes us ask the final, most difficult questions. How many families were permanently destroyed by the political divisions of the post-war world? How many children grew up believing their parents were dead, when in fact they were alive, just on the other side of a wall? And what is the true legacy of a conflict that did not really end in 1945, but continued to claim victims, separating families and breaking hearts for another half a century? The joyous reunions are the stories we celebrate, but they are a tiny handful of lights in a vast, dark ocean of what was lost forever.